In today's episode, we are going to explore the notion of transactional analysis and how we might use that in coaching.
Yeah, and we thought this was really interesting to do because we believe, coaching is about non-judgmental support and challenge to help someone develop awareness and responsibility. And TA really emphasizes personal responsibility, growth, self-awareness, and choice. So they really are very aligned from a philosophical point of view.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things when we were talking about this topic, there's quite a range of coaching approaches, and at the one end of a spectrum, if you wanted to use that term, you might have quite a psychodynamic approach, which is where TA would sit, which is where we're really thinking about our history and our background and how that might have shaped us into the human beings that we are today. And then right at the other end of that spectrum, you might have more of a sort of solutions focused approach, where you might be thinking about the future and far less interested in the past, very much thinking about where am I going, how do I get there. So that's where something like the GROW model sits really well. So it's quite a broad spectrum of coaching approaches, and TA is very much positioned in that more psychodynamic space.
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually when you think about the different techniques in TA. There is a big bunch of it that is more psychodynamic in approach. But there's also other stuff that is very much you can use in the moment that's actually got nothing to do with your past because you're analyzing transactions,
Yeah.
right in the here and now. So I think actually it's interesting that the field of TA covers quite a lot, and it's a way of looking between people and inside people in order to help them make changes. So again, philosophically, it's really well aligned.
And building on your point there about you can use it in the here and now. That's often how I might use it, as almost as a lens to apply to a situation. So particularly if somebody's coming in with a relationship challenge, it may well be, to your point there, we'd be looking at the interactions between people in order to help them think about how they might make some changes or make some improvements.
Yeah, and I think one of the differences from a lot of coaching techniques is when you work with TA, you'll actually teach them. It gets a little bit teachy at times because you have to teach the models to the client, then the clients actually use the models, so you use them together. So it's a little bit different. But before we get into anything, I just want to. One of these I love TA is I love the philosophy behind TA. And there's three key assumptions. So I should say that it comes from psychotherapy, but originally that's where it came from. But it's also been used in education, it's used in organizations, it's used in lots of different fields. So it's not just a psychotherapeutic model. But originally, Eric Berne, who came up with it, he had three assumptions. And the first is everyone's okay. We've all got inherent value, we're worthy of being treated with dignity and respect, etc. So everyone is okay. That's the number one. Number two, everyone has the capacity to think and decide for themselves, solve their own problems. Very aligned with a coaching philosophy. And the third is physis, which is really just means that growth and development is our natural desire. We have a natural desire to do that, and that's like an assumption we make in coaching anyway. So philosophically, I think it's really good from that perspective.
Yeah, and I guess a thought that's coming into my mind now as listeners tune into this is, but I thought that coaching was future focused. You didn't sort of look into the past. How is that different to therapy? And I want to just kind of address that point a little bit, I think, because by talking about the spectrum that we mentioned earlier, and you're talking there about the psychodynamic aspect and its roots are in therapy. It absolutely is used a lot in therapy, the TA approach, but how can we bring it into coaching in a way that's safe and within the sort of ethical boundaries of coaching? What are your thoughts on that, Gregor?
Well, the way I position it in a chemistry session, for example, is I say, I'm not interested in doing therapy. I'm not going to ask you to lie on a couch and tell you about your childhood. But I am interested in the decisions that you made early on in life that are now playing out now and getting in the way. And those might have been really good decisions for you then, But
Yeah.
if they're automatically playing out now, they're not useful for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difference between therapy. But in therapy, you would want to really dig down into what was going on, how did your script develop, etc. We're not interested in that. We are interested in the here and now, and how do we want to be more choiceful in the moment, looking forward, than
Yeah.
automatic choices. So it's quite a lot of the TA from a psychodynamic approach is about taking stuff that's subject and making it object. Take stuff that you have been doing unconsciously and bring it into your awareness and consciousness such that you can make a different choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. And I would do something very similar. And I would just describe it as, if we're working with whatever you're bringing to the coaching session here and now, if we completely ignore the past and where you might have learned, as you say, to make these sorts of decisions, then we're missing such a huge piece of the jigsaw. So as coaches, it's more of an acknowledgement of the past rather than a deep dive, which is what you might do in therapy.
Exactly. And I think one of the key things is when those decisions were created, they were really good decisions at the time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they would have been really valuable and really important.
They
Yeah.
were formed with a positive purpose. They would have been really good for you. But now they're getting in the way. So we need to be able to make another choice. So we need to bring them into our awareness.
Yeah, and just building on that point, the decisions. When you're talking about decisions, the way I think about this, and tell me whether you're in agreement, is they become behavioural patterns. They become automatic ways of being in the world because they work really well for us in our childhood. And so what we're doing in coaching is we're almost shining a light on that and saying, okay, so let's explore this. How is this working for you now? And actually, is that valuable? Or are there some changes that would be useful for you to make, given whatever it is you're bringing to that coaching session?
It's not only that they've been useful for us in our childhood, they've been useful for us as like a 43-year-old male or female, in a big business. They might have
Yeah,
been really useful up until we get a certain role, and then suddenly, this is
yeah.
getting in the way.
Yeah, so the phrase I use there is that it's your winning formula, right? It's worked
Yeah,
really well for
and
you.
suddenly it's a losing formula. And you need to learn to do something. But we're not going to really talk about much about the psychodynamic element really in this intro. I think one of the key things is to just go back to the basics in terms of when we talk about transactional analysis. I think the way I position it is when two people, we exist in our interactions, we exist in our conversations, our relationships with others, and but our transactions it's not between Gregor and Sarah, it's between our ego states. So we've got interpersonal relationships and also intrapsychic relationships between the voices in our head that we all have, but those transactions are made between ego states, and probably the most important elements to cover really what we call the parent adult child or the pack model.
Just to clarify what we mean by transactions as well, because that is TA talk. But for someone listening who's maybe not really experienced TA before, transactions for me is almost like an interaction between one ego state and another ego state, which I know we're going to jump into in a minute. But it's a way of thinking about a relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, well, a transaction is, would you like a cup of tea? No, thanks, I've just had one. That's a
Yeah,
transaction. Just as I hate you, and then the response you get,
yes,
they're all transactions, but they
yes,
will. But what you're unpicking with TA is the transactions are between ego states, not between people, and it's how
yeah.
those transactions work. And just by exposing that model to people, people can suddenly go, "Oh, now I see what's going on."
So let's jump into the parent adult child, because this is something I'll very often bring up in a coaching session. I know you will do too. And often this will be a case of pen and paper, or if you're doing it virtually using a whiteboard or whatever's your preferred way of doing it. And so we will share some visuals to go alongside this podcast. But there's basically three ego states, isn't there? Parent, adult, and child.
And I often start off with the adult because I think it's the easiest to understand. The adult is in the here and now.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really involved with any emotions. Everything's neutral. It's very objective. Like I said, would you like a cup of tea? No, thank you very much. I've just had one. That's an
Yes.
adult transaction. But it's very
Yeah.
much in the here and now, and it's not really contaminated by any strong emotions or values.
From the
So that's why
past.
my simple description of what the adult ego state is. Have you got anything that you would add to that?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, building on what you said there, was like a cup of tea. No, I've just had one. It's the sort of, we're recording this on a Thursday afternoon, and it's 3:36. It literally is here and now, right now.
Yeah, absolutely. What we did 5 minutes ago is in the past. It's not an adult
Yeah, yeah. So it's
anymore.
literally in this moment. Yeah, and
Right.
so thinking then about the other ego states. So when I describe the child ego state, I tend to describe them almost as a reservoir of experience that lives within our bodies, within our systems. So I see that as a reservoir of thoughts, feelings, beliefs that I will have taken on, that I will have developed as a child, that made sense for me at that time, given the environment and the context that I was living within.
Yeah, I mean, so it's thoughts, feelings, and behaviours that I have learned to date. But we learned to laugh as a child. We learned to be angry as a child. We learned to be rebellious. So it's where our reservoir of emotions and emotional states tend to be in the child.
Yeah,
So if I'm being very emotional, often it will be coming from a child ego state because
yeah,
that's where so if we're having a quick joke and a banter, the chances are we're both in child and it's a child interaction.
yeah.
And we should say that all of the interactions are valid between any of the ego states. We should say that.
Yes, I like using the language of reservoir though, because it feels like it's. I imagine it as a pool of water that exists, but it doesn't dominate, and it's not. It's not all of me. It's just part of me,
Yeah,
and it's a
absolutely.
way. It's a way of thinking about and understanding. What's happening. In these interactions that we're. Whatever might be bringing to the coaching session. So, what
Yeah.
would you describe for the for the parent ego state?
Well, I think I like one of your phrases. It's the things that you've swallowed whole. The
Yeah,
things that come from outside of you that you've swallowed whole. But that's often rules, principles, values that have come from your real parents and your societal parent. I grew up in a very working class, socialist uh, household. So I grew up thinking all English people were horrible. That was my parental structure. But I soon found out that that wasn't true. There's nice people and not so nice people whichever country you go to. But that was in my parent.
yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? Because when we're small, your parents are your everything. They're your world, and they a main source of where you learn about the world. And so
Yeah,
you do tend to take that on and swallow it whole. And it's not until you become maybe an adult in the here and now, when that might get challenged, and you kind of go, oh, maybe that isn't a useful way of thinking about the world. And not that this is what we're talking about in this podcast, but often that's where things like unconscious bias will kick in. And it's not until we become aware of where we've taken those beliefs, and where we're holding them, that that's when we can start to take control of our biases and take
yeah.
action.
I mean, I'm old enough that I grew up in the '70s, and the black and white minstrel shows on the television. The existing social construct was it was okay to have the black and white minstrel show on. So there was a different set of rules in society than there are now. So the parental rules have changed. So clearly you would it's called cathexis when you take something and you realize, well, I don't believe that. I'm going to chuck that out and have my own belief
Yeah.
um, in something.
So we've talked about the different ego states, or reservoirs, as I would tend to refer to them. So why might we use this in a coaching session? I guess in my experience, it's usually when I'm wanting to support a client to understand why they might be thinking or feeling or behaving in the way that they are. And usually it's because they've been triggered into either their parent or their child ego state. And when I say triggered, that might show up in a number of different ways, right? It could be their thinking, the sorts of words they're using. It could be the emotions they're sharing, as you mentioned before. If you're in child ego state, it may well be that, it's the emotions that you're feeling. I also, because I like to work with the body, may also notice particular maybe body language, or it may be, I've had it before where they're sort of touching their neck. Is they're talking about something, I'd be curious about that. And, so it might be something that's been reflected in their body as well that would indicate that perhaps they're not in the here and now, they're in the past somewhere.
Yeah. So that's definitely something I get people to do, is to journal or record what the triggers are that might trigger them into a non-resourceful state. And that's often child, especially if you're thinking about more junior people, that they get triggered into this non-resourceful state, and that's often child. So they'll have a stimulus in the environment that will do that. Now, so here's a perfect example. You got somebody, they're normally very confident, and I'm actually thinking of one finance director, and she's perfectly fine. She's really confident, can present really, really well, until the chief exec walks into the room. And then suddenly they're triggered and they start falling apart. Because what's happened is that parent figure, who's quite stern in their body language, then suddenly they get triggered into child and they lose confidence. And suddenly they're feeling quite vulnerable. So their feelings have changed. They become nervous. They may even turn a bit pale, but their shoulders might droop. So you can see in their body language, they don't look very confident, they don't feel very confident, and the voices in their head are saying, "Oh God, you're screwing this up." So that's a really good example of somebody being triggered into child, and for them to be able to realize that. And this is a bit of lingo. Functional adult means I realize I've been triggered into child. I can see from adult I've been triggered. It's not just happening to me. I realize it's happened to me. I go, okay, now I can be choiceful about it.
Well, and building on that, what I think is interesting with that situation is this person, when the chief executive is in the room, it's triggering them into child. It could be that that person reminds them of their father. It might not be that he looks like her father or sounds like her father, but it's simply the fact that he is a senior, powerful man. Exactly.
I'm looking down my nose at my teacher used to. Again, these are the sort of physical things. And so
Yeah.
in TA, you talk about psychological communication, and psychological
Yeah.
communication is what comes through in your tonality. Like I can say, I like you, or I can say, oh, I like you. Two totally different meanings to the same words. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the psychological communication, what we do with our voice and our physiology, is always more important than the words that we use.
It's so powerful. And do you know what it really makes me think about is this is usually unconscious, right? Until we become aware of it, until we do the journaling that you're talking about and thinking about why we're being triggered, it's unconscious. So we kind of our body takes over, the anxiety kicks in, the heart rate increases, we go pale, we forget our words, and we become, a much smaller version of ourselves. But we don't necessarily understand why we're doing that. And until a coach comes along and offers the possibility that maybe this is what's going on, you can't figure it out. You just think, God, why do I always do that in front of him? My God, it's so annoying.
Yeah. I just think it's not so often I think about people being triggered into parent, but I had this instance where a little kid, he was getting dragged along by his parents, and as he passed this counter, it had lots of brochures on it, and he deliberately knocked them off, and his parents hadn't seen it. Totally automatically, my parent came out and just went, pick that up, in a really stern voice, and he just went, oh, and he picked him up. But it was like it happened automatically. It wasn't me. It just suddenly, it was my parent doing it. It could have been my grandfather or my father doing it, But I was suddenly triggered into a parent ego state by that child's action, because that's just not on in my set of rules.
Yeah. And a way, I guess, of thinking about a transaction is almost like an invitation, isn't it? So with you pushing your glasses down, looking down at me, it's almost an invitation from your parent, into my child. And so that's when we can start thinking about these transactions. It's because there's something in what you're saying or doing that is triggering something in me that's inviting me to revisit that moment or those memories or that experience from the
Hmm.
past.
Yeah,
And that's where it can be so powerful in coaching, because it's just offering that lens. It's a different way of looking at something and reflecting on something. And then, as you say, inviting a maybe more choiceful, resourceful um, course of action instead.
yeah. And then you've got that language structure that you can use between coach and coachee to
Yeah.
to talk about those situations in terms of, I'd said, behaviours and feelings and thoughts. Absolutely.
So, just to kind of draw this to a close, thinking about the three ego states, we've talked about how we can get invited into one and from somebody else's behaviors or what things they might say. Another way of thinking about how we can apply the ego states is the "I'm okay, you're okay." And I can't remember whose model is that. Where does that come from?
You've got me. I can't remember the exact model, exactly who came back. I think it probably was originally Eric Berne that came up with it, because he came up with the concept of games, which we're going to cover off in the drama triangle. I'm okay, you're okay. That's the only place you can have truly authentic communication. And what I mean by I'm okay, you're okay is I'm okay with me and I'm okay with you. I've got no idea what's going on inside your head. But so quite often people say, I'm okay, you're okay. They're thinking, well, I'm okay. And that other person is okay. No, it's I'm okay with me and I'm okay with you. But I might be coming from the state I was in with the little boy who was spilling the papers. I'm okay with me. I'm not okay with you.
Yeah, and that's where the critical voice might come in. And often we do work with this in coaching, where you might have someone who just is constantly focused on, I've got to get it right, I've got to be perfect, I've got to please other people, all sorts of drivers, which we're going to talk about in a separate episode. But it's often comes from where you've grown up with that kind of critical voice.
Being surrounded by a critical parent, I'm okay, you're not okay. And you've got a very critical boss. They're always harping about the mistakes you make, never give you any positive stuff. Therein, I'm okay, you're not okay. That will often trigger you into, I'm not okay, you're okay. So I'm
Yeah,
not okay with me, but I'm okay with you. I'm being persecuted by you. That would be probably put me into child. So you've got, I'm okay, you're okay. I'm okay, you're not okay. I'm not okay, you're okay. And there's a final position, which is I'm not okay, you're not okay, which means is, you know what? I've done everything I can possibly do, and you're never going to change. So what's the point? So that's why it's called the futility position. And that's when
yeah,
people give up. And you will quite often get coaches who might come to you with a situation which is they're in futility position. They've
yeah.
given up with their boss and they've given up because they can't think of anything else to do.
Mm.
So I think it's quite important to get those four positions, and those are the different, but we always want to be as far as possible. I'm okay, you're okay.
And again, where this can be really powerful in coaching is looking at relational dynamics, hearing issues within teams or with bosses or with colleagues, and just offering this as a perspective. Where might you be in relationship with this person right now? Are
Mm-hmm.
you in I'm okay, you're not okay? Or, are you in I'm not okay, you are okay? Or it might be something else. It doesn't have to just be those two options. But again, it can really provoke some valuable learning and reflection just by offering that as a perspective.
Yeah, and for example, when I do a stop, so it's a little technique I teach people to do, but I'll go through a whole physical thing in terms of your breathing, etc. But then I always get them to ask the question in their head, what's my intent towards this person or people? And that question is designed to check whether or not they're in I'm okay, you're okay.
Yeah,
Because if I want to get them, if I'm really angry with them, I'm going to be in I'm okay, you're not okay. If
yeah,
I'm scared of them, I'm going to be, I just want to please them, then I might be in I'm not okay, you're okay.
yeah,
You're not going to have authentic communication that way. You have to be, I'm okay with me and I'm okay with you. And that's what that question is designed to elicit, really. It's a good
yeah.
little check before you have an important interaction. to check, okay, what's my intent towards this person? And it will surface where you are.
Yeah. And so I think bringing all of this together, why are we talking about this? We're wanting to do a series here where we're going to actually have some examples of talking through how might we use this kind of a model in our work with our coaching clients. So in future episodes, listeners will be able to tune in, and we're going to pick up on some particular sorts of themes and topics that we tend to hear, and then go, how might we apply a TA lens to this sort of issue?
Yeah, and we've created a couple of avatars, a couple of sample clients that will take you through and will give you challenges and show how we might apply TA in a coaching context and how the tool can be used like that way.